Good morning. When I first came to this church 80 years ago, I was a bit fleeter than I am now. But I'll never forget it. We're sitting back there. I was 5.5 at the time, and so you know my age now. It was a remarkable experience for me. Particularly, the minister was a real raver. He shouted, and it's the only time I've gone out of this church scared. In these days, the pulpit came much further forward, and there was a different configuration here. But I'll never forget that. I've sat through many sermons here. Some were brilliant, some were average, and some were below average. But none of yours were in that category. It was probably my own fault, the below average ones, because it was often after a sociable Saturday night. And I was sitting next to my father in that pew at the pillar, and he was aware that I wasn't just 100%, and he'd give me a gentle nudge if I started nodding a bit. It's a special occasion for me because this church has meant a lot to me over the 80 years that I've worshipped here. I think that I've been privileged to be here. It's been a good place to be. Unfortunately, there are very few of the faces that I saw then still here today. I think I'm about the only one. Better get the specs on. Over the years, this morning I'm glad to speak about courage, of which there are many variations. I've been going to speak about 3 people I'm going to speak about. One I didn't know at all. The other 2 I knew very well. I considered them my friends. They were totally different. The one I didn't know, you may have heard of. He was called, Donald Caskey. You may have read this book, The Tartan Pimpernel. He was an Hebridean, born in Isle of Islay. His parents both spoke Gaelic at home, and they were, like a lot of the island people, they were very keen on religion and in education. And it was just as well because he was a very bright man. He went to Bowmore School and finished it at this age isn't a good thing. Dunoon High School. He then went to Edinburgh University and studied theology, and then to Edinburgh College where he did a doctorate. He was obviously very bright because he got a scholarship to America and he did well there. When he came back, he eventually got his own charge at Gretna, which is a small church down in the Solway Firth. From Gretna, he was called to the Scots Kirk in Paris, which was a very coveted position, I believe. He was not just a preacher, and I'm told a brilliant preacher, but he was a very good pastoral minister, and people had a great respect for him in Paris, in his congregation. He denounced the Nazis and Hitler regularly from his pulpit, and when the sound of German guns got within range of Paris, his friends said, "Look, you'll better get out because they won't have any time for you." he reluctantly did. But before he did, he went round his old parishioners and said goodbye, and he was quite convinced a lot of them he wouldn't see again. Well, the kind of man he was, he didn't think of himself, and he took his case with a few possessions, no food, and started walking for the south. Of course, there were great crowds, and there was an exodus of people, refugees, soldiers, beaten soldiers. The whole road was covered in people. He said that eventually he was exhausted, and after 20 miles he lay down at the side of the road and slept. It had been a good day, but that night it poured with rain and he was soaked. But he said once he got up and got going again, he was all right. But remember, he hadn't eaten, he'd walked a long way, and he'd been under a lot of stress. He carried on. The next day, he found an old byre, and he got in, and there was some straw, and he lay down, and he said there was a cow, and she gently chewed her cud, and she was good company. She mooed occasionally. The following day, he got up, still hadn't eaten, and started walking. But he saw someone with an old bike, and he managed to buy it for very little. And that helped. He got on the bike, and he got a few faster miles. When he'd gone a good bit, he came on a vineyard, and he got a lot of grapes in the vineyard, and he said that sustained him, and he felt different after that. He hadn't gone much further when suddenly he got to a village, and a crowd rushed at him and started threatening him and really showing aggression. The local policeman came, and he saw him too and put handcuffs on him because they thought he was a spy. He said, look, I'm a Scottish minister and I'm very pro-French. Well, the policeman took his case into the police station, opened it up, and the first thing that came out was a Bible, and the second thing was his kilt. So that saved him. So the policeman, he got a bed for the night and breakfast next morning, and when he got out of the police station, the crowd was all there cheering him on, because the rumour had gone round that he wasn't a spy. But the reason was that there was a transfer on the mudguard of this bike with a swastika on it. Well, he kept going. He had more adventures and got to Marseille, where he went to the Seamen's Mission. And over the next 2 years, he conducted a great help for people who were on the way, who rescued them to pass on to the underground and get them back to Britain. He had refused a place on a ship because he thought that he ought to stay, and there was French people who needed it much more than he did. That was the kind of man he was. He was accredited with indirectly being responsible for over 1,000 men getting back to Britain from refugees, from air pilots who'd been shot down, with soldiers who got away, and escaped prisoners. I read that he was not a brave man, he was exceedingly courageous, but he didn't ever carry arms or work with the underground. He eventually was ordered out of Marseille by the local police. They knew that he was into helping people. And he went to Grenoble, which was a university town for those who know about universities. I don't. But it was a very much more sophisticated place in Marseille. And he got on well there because he could speak French fluently, and he was very accepted by the locals. There was also quite a large Jewish community. Eventually, his luck ran out, and the Gestapo arrested him, took him to prison. He was fairly violently interrogated, but he didn't say he was tortured. But he lived in a dark cell, lying on stinking straw, and food came once a day with a foot canister of water. He survived that, but eventually he went for trial, a Gestapo trial, and he was sentenced to death. But luckily for him, there was a Lutheran pastor whom he had got friendly with at Grenoble, and he saved them, really, and they became friends for life. Anyway, he survived until the end of the war. Then he went back to his old church, which unfortunately, he said 20 years of sermons were, I don't know, it was 20 years, the worst sermons that he had laid back, they were gone. But all the vestments and the church stuff was still there. He was decorated by the French government for his efforts and what he'd done for France. He eventually got back to Islay and saw his old parents who he hadn't seen for 7 years, and it was great to be reunited. And he then came back to Paris and started working on the church. It took him many years to raise the money, but the Queen was there to lay the stone for the building for the new church, which there were many contributions for. That was Donald Caskey. My next character, I said there were many variations in this, was Margaret Donaldson, who was a member of this church. Now I first remember Margaret trudging through the snow in 1947 when the drifts were hot to the electric poles, and she never missed delivering the mail. Changed days. She struggled on, and she was always smiling. My mother always had a plate of soup for her. Margaret had a very hard upbringing. Her father was the gatekeeper at Gloucester Law Gates in somewhere between Arbroath and Freetham, I think. And he had a tied house, which was a simple house, and Margaret took work, mostly on the farms around. Eventually she met a fellow and fell in love, and they got a rented house in Mall Street in Carnoustie. They hadn't been there long when he died, and Margaret was a widow at a young age. But she never gave up, and she was a hard worker and a great friend to many. She eventually managed to save enough to do up her house, and she had a hut at the foot of the garden like many people in Carnoustie at that time, and she would let her house for holiday makers. She knew how to make a pub, but she knew even better how to keep it. A lot of people would learn a lot from Margaret today. When my grandmother got pretty infirm and old, Margaret's mother got her to go to be her home help and stay with her, and she was great. Father said Margaret was fantastically good, but her cooking was so frugal he didn't get excited about it. But he said, Margaret, you know, I don't like second-day toast. She was a wonderful lady, and Mary informed me, and I hadn't known about it, that the curtains in the hall originally, which had been taken down because they were done, were donated by Margaret before she died. She was always thinking of other people, never herself. To me, she was a courageous lady. Now, my last subject was also a very good friend, but he was a good friend and business partner of my father's. I think he was a brilliant man. He was modest. You wouldn't have thought he was a hero. He didn't behave like one, at least the way I think they would behave. But I'm going to read a few pieces about him here. That George Dunn, his first engagement, he was a major at that time, and he was in the Black Watch, and he fought at Alamein. It's ironical that the first time I was here 80 years ago, that was the Battle of Alamein time. His first serious engagement, or the first decoration he got, was fighting in Tunisia. He concealed his company on a steep rise, on a hill, in face of the bracing, the heavy mortar, and fire, a small fire, arms fire. He was also encountering snipers who were active in both flanks. Major Dunn didn't hesitate. In his personal example, I'm sorry, I need to get this closer. His personal example and bravery ensured that the point was occupied and the enemy destroyed. He exposed himself continuously without fear for his own life and his complete disregard for his safety, aside possible the taking and holding of the feature, the importance of which could not be exaggerated. I'll not try and read it anymore, I can remember it. At the next battle in Sicily, he exposed himself continuously, although he was wounded, and they said he did the work of 3 men. He fought all night and he saved the situation, and for that he was awarded a DSO. So already he had an MC and DSO. He was quite badly wounded in Sicily and he had to go back to Britain, but he was patched up before D-Day and he landed there, and by this time, because he was part of the HLI, he was put in command of a battalion of Seaforths. There he fought again, and he said he showed the courage of 3 men and he saved the situation, and he got a bar to his DSO. Now, a gentler, kinder, more decent man you couldn't meet. And I will always consider myself lucky to have known him. He was awarded a CBE and something else after, when the Queen later on was Deputy Lord Lieutenant of the county. Lastly, I would like to say, you'll see I've got a gong here. Now, I don't want you to be under any misapprehension or misunderstanding. It's not for bravery. Everyone who was at Suez got one. And the only thing is I got my name on it. If you consider, on the ship I was on, I was part of the guns crew, and we were lying 10 miles off Suez, and we had put these 10-inch shells into the gun, which fired at Egyptians 10 miles away. If that's bravery, then I would claim to have been brave. Although we did get a bit of fun when we went ashore later on. It was a good life. Anyway, that's about as much as I can say. I would just like to say thank you for putting up with me.
thank you, Willie. A reminder today that courage comes in different forms, and Willie gave us 3 examples of which we should celebrate really in different ways these people showed courage. And not only that, selfless commitment to others in the face of adversity. Again, different kinds of adversity. We live with that legacy and we all know these people. So thank you, Willie. We sing again. 268, O God of Bethel, by whose hand? 268.